everyone. Welcome to the And God Said podcast. I'm Reverend Kimberly Constant, and I am your host for this podcast that I offer in conjunction with an online Bible study I teach called Cover to Cover, in which we read through the Bible from Genesis all the way to Revelation. And if you're interested in finding more, I have reading plans, I have discussion questions, I have the opportunity to join Zoom discussion groups. You can find out more information on my website, KimberlyConstantMinistries.com. So today we are going to talk about a fascinating book, a difficult book. There's some terrible stories to read about, but one that is also extremely important. It's the book of Judges, and a look at what happens when people forget and go their own way and forget to follow the will of God. So where we left off, at the conclusion of the book of Joshua, things were pretty good for the Israelites. They had emphatically, if you remember, rededicated themselves to the covenant. That was Joshua's last thing he did before he died, is to make sure that they understood the covenant terms. And 3 times over, he has them pledge themselves to that covenant. They had divided up the land. The eastern tribes headed back home across the Jordan River to settle their territories, and things are pretty good. But quickly we read in Judges, after the death of Joshua, the Israelites asked the Lord, "Who of us is to go up first to fight against the Canaanites?" And that's Judges 1:1. So, whoa, okay, we go, I thought everything was settled at the end of Joshua. Clearly not the case. Maybe not all was quite as good as it seemed. So as we discussed in the Joshua lectures, Canaanites still remained in the land, despite the bravado, despite the braggadocio associated with conquest literature, which is what Joshua was. There are still people left. They still had some people to contend with. More fighting loomed ahead, and with it, more temptation. So let's first look at the prologue, the first 3.5 chapters or so of the book of Judges. So the opening lines reveal that, like we just said, the Israelites did not drive all the people out of the land. And God admonished them, not only for failing to do this, but for making covenants with some of the Canaanites. Now that language right there should be enough to alert our ears to some very nefarious things happening. To make a covenant with someone is to enter into a formal, familial relationship. As we've learned about the importance of covenants and that God made several covenants with the people. And here they're making covenants with the very people they were supposed to drive out of the land. Not good. And God also reminded them of his prophetic words via Moses that their failure to drive these people out would be the result of their downfall. And we're going to see that happen in this book. And then God goes on to say, in fact, I'm going to use this to test you. And it's a test they're going to fail, and very clearly so. And so we read in Judges 3, verses 5 through 6, the Israelites lived among the Canaanites, the Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivitites, and Jebusites, all the ites. They took their daughters in marriage and gave their own daughters to their sons and served their gods. So they made covenants. They had intermarriages, also bad, also prohibited, and they served their gods. So they abandoned their worship of the one true God and turned towards the pagan little g gods of these people groups. Bad, bad, bad. And that's just the first 3 chapters. And so this sets the scene for this time of the Judges. So we now look at what happens during the reign of these judges, and it's a cycle of sin, and it's chapters 3 starting at around verse 7 all the way through chapter 16. And we see a cycle of sin, repentance, and deliverance. So the people forget what God has done, they turn away from God, they sin, which sin is to turn away from God, it's to miss the mark and to go about your own will that goes against the will that God has. Because of this, God removes that hand of protection. Remember, one of the tenets of the covenant was, as long as you're obeying the covenant, the land will be fruitful for you. It will bless you. You yourselves will be fruitful. You will be protected. But if you fail to uphold the covenant, I'm going to remove that hand of protection. And so he does. And the surrounding ites, the Canaanites, all those other people groups I talked about, they're just waiting. Like, great, we're going to take advantage of this situation. And so they oppress the people. After a while, it depends on where we are in the cycle. The people finally go, okay, we're going to turn back to God. God, please help us. We're sorry. Please save us from this oppression. And then when they do that, they petition God. He raises up a judge. And this judge becomes the means to deliver the people. So the judge often leads them in battle or some other kind of experience, helps them to come out of this oppression and delivers them. And in delivering the people, notice, as you read, God also delivers the land itself. And so it will say the land rested or had rest for any number of years. It depends, again, on which judge we're talking about and on where they are in the cycle. This, and then quickly, sometimes the people forget once more, turn away from God and sin, and the cycle starts all over again. Eventually, the cycle itself unravels. And after the judgeship of Gideon, we'll notice that the land no longer receives rest, and the people stop crying out to God. When they're oppressed, they don't cry out to God. They just try to deal with things in their own way, which is not good. So what was a judge? Well, it's not what we think of when we think of a judge today, for instance. So you think of a judge today, you think of someone who has a legal task to interpret the law of the land, to decide if someone is guilty or innocent of trespassing or doing something against the law. Well, that was not the case for these judges. So legal disputes were actually presided over by elders of the tribe or family heads, kind of the heads of the clan. They would sit at the city gates, people would bring their disputes to them, and they would decide them there. Religious leaders would help as well when it was some kind of religious law that was involved. So the Old Testament judges were actually military deliverers, more like army commanders, if you will. Most of them were chosen by God himself to drive out the oppressor and give rest to the land and the people. Some of the judges are also chosen by the people. We'll look at that in their stories. As I said before, the judges overlap one another. Multiple skirmishes are happening at the same time, and different judges are raised up by God to deliver different parts of Israel, because Israel is not a whole yet. They're organized, as I said in the last lecture, by tribal entities. So each tribe is kind of out for itself. So the judges of Israel, there's 12 that are talked about here. We get more information about certain of them, and certain of them, it's not very much. Like Shamgar is like, yeah, there was this judge Shamgar, and he ruled for, however many years, or he defeated this group of people. And then some of them, like Deborah, we get multiple chapters about her, or Gideon, or Samson. And the time of rest after each judgeship, after that cycle I was talking about, differs depending on the judge in question. So you can see there's kind of no rhyme or reason. What is helpful, I think, if you're able to look at the PowerPoint for this podcast, if you sign up for the study, you'll get it in a newsletter where you can pull this up and look at it, and you'll see which tribe each judge is associated with. So that kind of helps you understand the areas that are dealing with more skirmishes. So I also have a map here, and it's really the central part of Israel. The northern tribes of Asher and Naphtali, we don't really see them mentioned very much. The very most southern tribes, which is Simeon and like the southernmost portion of Judah, don't come into play. Reuben doesn't really come into play. It's that center portion. So Manasseh, which is on both sides of the Jordan River, they have people on the east and the west. There's Dan, Ephraim, Benjamin, Gad. Some of the parts of Judah, for instance, Zebulun, Issachar, like it's the middle region. If you can picture Israel, like picture where Jerusalem is, it's just right there in the heart of Israel. And it's actually interesting, so much so they fight these skirmishes, especially Dan, because if you look at the map, you'll see the Philistines are right next to Dan. And so they have so much pressure from them that they actually relocate. The whole entire tribe moves because they just can't handle the pressure that they're experiencing. So that Dan is originally right next to the Philistines. They move north and they become the northernmost tribe. And in modern day times, the area of Dan is right at the border of Lebanon. And that happens it's talked about actually in Joshua as well. Joshua 19, but it's also talked about in Judges 18, that Dan sets out to find new territory because of all of the pressure that they experience from the Philistines. So again, if you can look at this presentation, I have a picture of Dan. When I went to Israel, we went there. We stood at this northernmost point. And in the picture, you can see a trench left over from the Arab-Israeli War in 1948, which you've probably heard a lot about. As I'm recording this lecture, all of the events in the Middle East make this very prescient, and all of this is coming up in the news again. And then you can see a road in the picture, and if you zoom in, there's a white car on the road. That's a UN peacekeeping car, and the road is the border between Israel and what is now Lebanon. And then if you take out a magnifying glass or zoom in and look at the top of the mountain, you'll notice like a white compound, and that is a Hezbollah compound. Our guide was telling us, oh yeah, they probably have telescopes trained on us right now to watch our activities and what we're doing. And so it's just eerie to think about it because this is all involved in the current conflict happening in the Middle East. So I just thought you'd be interested in seeing what that looks like. It's actually such beautiful land, and it's just heartbreaking to know how much bloodshed it's seen. All right, so I'm going to talk about some of the judges' stories, pull out a few of them that have either interesting elements or just a lot more information. So the first judge I want to talk about is Ehud. I call him the cunning judge. So we learn a little bit about him. He's left-handed, and he's a member of the Benjamite tribe. And he conceals a double-edged sword and tricks his way into the presence of the king of Moab, Eglon. And Eglon is a quite large man by description. And so when Ehud drives his sword deep into the belly of Eglon, he's so big, his belly is so big that the sword becomes lost in it. And I just put in the PowerPoint because, it's so gross and detailed. Right? It's a gross story. But because of this, after this event, Israel is able to subdue Moab. Ehud fulfills his role as a judge, and the land and the people have rest. Then the next judge I want to talk about is Deborah. I call her the best of the best. She's the only female judge. The Bible also notes that she is a prophetess as well. And she is perhaps the best of the judges. We don't read of any wrongdoing. We don't read of like the gross violence of shoving a sword into someone's belly and it getting lost there. She just, I don't know. Her story to me reads like she's a shining example. And so it reads in Judges 5:7, she says, villagers in Israel would not fight. They held back until I, Deborah, arose, until I arose, a mother in Israel. So that's saying something. I mean, women at this time typically were pretty marginalized. So the fact that God raised her up to be a judge and that she was so revered that Israel would not fight until she went forward with them, that's amazing. That's amazing. Also, testimony to God using women in leadership. We will talk more about that when we get to the New Testament. So Deborah has a right-hand man named Barak. He refuses to go into battle without Deborah because at one point she's like, you go do this, I'm going to go do this. And he says, no, I'm not going anywhere without you. And she says, that's fine. But just so you know, the honor of defeating Sisera is now going to fall to a woman, Jael. And indeed it does. So Jael, the wife of Heber, welcomes Sisera into her tent. And I'm sure he saw her and this unassuming woman. She's going to feed me and protect me. And so she gains his trust. What's this woman going to do to me? He goes into her tent. He trusts her so much that he falls asleep and he tells her to keep watch. And if anyone goes by, to just tell him that her tent is empty. And she takes that opportunity to drive a tent peg through his temple. Go Jael. And Deborah's like, yes, she sings a song about her. And the glory goes to Jael when it could have gone to Barak had he had the courage to go forth without Deborah. So just super interesting, this story and the courage of these women that is honored and revered and talked about in the Bible. We've definitely seen some courageous acts from women so far in the Old Testament. Next, let's talk about Gideon. I call him the reluctant leader. When God called, he responds in a way that reminds me a lot of Moses. First, he says, well, why have you let all this happen? Like, why is there even a need to raise up a judge? Like, everything is bad. Why is that? And that just shows you, by the way, that the perspective of a normal person, if you will, or like he was normal, up until he became a judge anyway. Like, they don't necessarily know all the reasoning behind it. They don't know that certain skirmishes are being fought by tribes that aren't near them. Most people are just unaware, as typically happens. It's the leadership that is really the ones dealing with it. So he says, why do you even let us be oppressed in the first place? And then he says, well, why me? I'm the least in my family, and we are part of the weakest tribe. Why would you call on me to be a judge? And then he says, give me a sign. And then he says, give me another sign, and actually 2 more signs. And just a note there, better to ask for multiple signs than to act without seeking God at all. You'll notice God doesn't tend, or so far anyway in the stories we've seen, to get mad at people for asking for signs. He, usually complies and gives them some sort of sign. He did for Moses and Aaron. He does it here for Gideon multiple times when Gideon asks. You always should ask. Maybe it'll be an instance in which God doesn't give you a sign, because there are times when God just wants us to step out in faith, to step out in maturity, and to make a decision for ourselves. But if God wants us to act a certain way and we are unsure, we can ask for a sign. And if God needs to give us direction, God will give us signs. So I like that part of the story. So Gideon is renamed Jerubbaal, which means let Baal contend. So very good name for someone who is going to fight against the pagan people. It says in Judges 8:23, so successful that the people wanted him to rule them. So Gideon is so successful that the people are like, we want you to be our king. And he rightly responded, I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. Yes, Gideon gets it. This is the truth. God is their king. It's a theocracy. God is their leader. They don't need a human. A human's going to be ineffectual. Humans are imperfect. They have God as their leader. They just need to do what God is telling them to do. But then, Gideon, he does not, he makes a mistake, as we often see with imperfect people. He takes the people's gold and he makes an ephod. That's a garment that usually was worn by the priests. I talked about the ephod of the high priest when we looked at his dress and what he would wear. And so then the people begin to worship this ephod, this garment. And it's not good. So his is the last judgeship to result in peace for the land. After his reign, the cycle of sin and deliverance begins to break down. Now you'll see, like, after Samson, there's peace for the land, but remember, they're overlapping each other. So after this, the cycle breaks down. People stop calling out to God. He has a son by a concubine, and that son tries to take leadership over Israel. And one of the ways he tries to accomplish this is by murdering the rest of Gideon's sons. He's said to have 70 other sons. 70, that's some kind of symbolic number. And so he murders all of them to try to take power for himself. So we see this cycle of sin is just getting worse and worse. The next judge I want to talk about is Jephthah, and he is the judge that acts rashly, very rashly. So he is a judge that was appointed by the people themselves. They chose Jephthah. But God did not seem to have an issue with this. He doesn't say anything against it. And in fact, it's said that he sent his spirit to give Jephthah strength. But he makes a rash vow to God. Note, unprompted. God doesn't ask him to make a vow. He does it himself. And he says, quote, from Judges 11, verse 31, if you will give the Ammonites into my hands, whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return in triumph, I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering. Okay, first of all, did he need to make this vow? No. God would have given the Ammonites into his hands anyway. He was the judge that God was going to empower to deliver the people. This again shows the breakdown of faith, of understanding, of relationship with God, that he feels like he has to make this vow in order to secure victory. Notice he uses the word it. I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering. Well, the it's going to turn out, unfortunately, to be a person. He did not anticipate this, but it is his own daughter. And we see this in verse 34. And faithful girl that she is, her response to this is to say, you made a vow and you have to follow through. But she asks for 2 months to roam the hills and weep with her friends because she would not get to marry. That's verse 37. And then in verse 39, we read, and he meaning Jephthah, did to her as he had vowed, and she was a virgin. So, does this mean that he sacrificed his daughter, as in burned her up, as an offering to God? A lot of scholars say no. They suggest that rather she became an attendant at the tabernacle. There were women that served at the entrance to the tent of the tabernacle. This typically was a role reserved for widows. Again, remember, if you were a widow, it was very difficult to provide for yourself. There were not jobs that you could go out and get. So you had to rely on the mercy of people. And so here was a role that could be given to a widow to allow her, as she's serving there, she would have gotten some of the food from the sacrifices. So the reason scholars are thinking that he might have done this is because he is included, Jephthah, in Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11 is kind of the hall of fame of faith, and it goes through several people from the Old Testament who it claims acted faithfully, Jephthah being one of them. And so scholars say, would he really be in this hall of fame of faith if he had actually sacrificed his own daughter, as in killed her, burned her up? So they think no, instead she was given to be this attendant. And to me, this makes sense as well, because there's provision where God will say things like, you owe me your firstborn son, but that son can be redeemed. So he didn't mean you had to kill your son and dedicate your son to God that way. You could redeem the son either through money, through offering a certain sacrifice, or through dedicating that child to serve at the temple. And we're going to see that actually in the story of Samuel when we get to it, I think next week in our study. So something similar probably happened here, where she's mourning because, she's not going to get to marry. She's going to have to go fulfill a role that is given to widows. So she's never going to get to marry. She's never going to get to have children. For all intents and purposes, she's a widow that never had a husband. And so she's going to have to serve the rest of her life in this widowed role. And so that makes sense to me. I think that is rational. We know that God does not condone the sacrifice of children. We saw it in the story of Abraham and Isaac. He offered a substitution in the ram. We've seen him say in black and white in the law, do not sacrifice your children. So here that this makes sense. And because he is in that hall of fame of faith, it makes sense to me that instead she just had to take on this role. It would have still been something very sad for her. Uh, Presumably, she would have wanted to get married and have her own children and have a life. And instead, she's got to go serve at the temple. So it's still something worth mourning. But I could be wrong. It could be that he did actually sacrifice her. We don't know for sure. The Hebrew language doesn't really make it clear what he did there. It just said he did to her as he had vowed. Okay, next let's look at Samson. We get a lot about his story. It's an extensive story, including even before he was born. And I call him the blind and blinded, sacrifice and sacrificed one. So he is dedicated to God as a Nazarite, which is kind of a living sacrifice. So Nazarites had to take certain vows, and we see that God asks this of his mother. So his parents are visited by a man of God, and so they dedicate him. And a Nazarite could not drink wine. They could not drink fermented drinks. They couldn't drink grape juice or eat grapes or raisins. They could not cut their hair for the entirety of the time they served out their vow. They could not touch or in any way have anything to do with a dead body. When the time of the vow ended, so this wasn't a lifelong thing. This wasn't like the same as dedicating your son to go work at the temple or a widow going to work at the temple. This was for a certain time period. It could be men or women, by the way. There were female Nazarites. When it ended, they would make a sacrifice to God, a votive offering, and then they would cut their hair, and that hair would be placed on the altar for God. And so we see that Samson is blind. He is meant to be a sacrifice, a living sacrifice, to live his life in a way that is sacrificially given to God. But we see that he is blind, although he has all this spiritual strength. He just gets taken in, doesn't he, by the women. The women in his life blind him and cause him to disobey. So first he marries a Philistine woman, and God uses it, as God does. But in the process, Samson disgraced his vow because he killed a lion, touching its dead body, and then he ate honey out of its carcass. Honey, and it was also something that he wouldn't have been able to eat. They had to make sure they only ate what was considered clean food. So he's like doubly breaking his vow there. And then with Delilah, she tricks him, beguiles him, if you will, into finally admitting that his weakness is his hair. And this allows him to be captured. So his hair is cut. Again, not something that wasn't supposed to happen if you were living out your Nazarite vow. But we see that the Philistines, when they capture him, gouge out his eyes. And so then he starts off what I would say spiritually blind, supposedly living as a spiritual sacrifice. He becomes physically blinded and then physically sacrifices himself. It's like once he's physically blinded, his spiritual sight opens up and he finds the ultimate strength to call upon God and to sacrifice himself in order to kill the rulers of the Philistines. So it's a really interesting story with just kind of unexpected twists to it. And like I said, this guy that was spiritually blind, when he becomes physically blind, his spiritual sight returns. This guy that was supposed to be a living sacrifice but doesn't do it well, when he is finally captured, he actually becomes a full-out sacrifice, sacrificing himself for the greater good of the people. So next we turn to the final segment of Judges, which deals with the consequences of defying God. So after Samson, everything falls apart altogether. We don't even hear about judges anymore. We just see the consequences of people who are no longer calling out on God. And it's the repeated refrain in this section is, in those days, Israel had no king. So some of the stories, we see a man named Micah who erected a shrine and elected his own son to be priest. So this is a flagrant violation of God's law. The priests were supposed to come from the Levitical clan. This was not something an ordinary Israelite had any business being involved with. Micah sets up his own household gods and has this priest preside over worship of these pagan gods. And then he conscripts a Levite to be his personal priest. So even worse, he finds this Levite along the way and says, hey, come live in my house and be my priest. Bad, bad, bad. All of those things are wrong. And then the story continues. The Levite's concubine, who was also his wife, they call her a concubine, but at one point they also call her his wife. Her story reminds us of Sodom and Gomorrah. If you remember, he gets taken in by someone offering hospitality, and then men come and try to attack them, and he offers up his wife to spare himself from being violated sexually. And so his wife is assaulted so severely that she dies from her wounds. And in response, the Levite cuts her into 12 pieces and sends a piece to each of the tribes. I don't even need to tell you how bad this is. This is a Levite. This is supposed to be the leadership of the people. And this is what is happening. This causes the rest of the tribes to rise up against the Benjamites in Gibeah. So that's the town in which this happened. And God enables the victory because what the Benjamites did was wrong. They resulted in this woman's death. They were Sodom and Gomorrah, doing wrong things. And God enabled the victory, but then the people took it too far. So that it says that they set fire to the towns and all that were in it. So they don't just avenge the death of this poor woman. They then go so far as to just willy-nilly kill everybody. They also make an oath not to give any of their daughters in marriage to the Benjamites that remained. So the idea being that the Benjamites will die off as a tribe because they will not be allowed to procreate. So after the battle with the Benjamites, the rest of the tribes gather together, and they discover that the clan of Jabesh Gilead did not show up. So they decide to avenge this. And so they kill everyone except the virgins of this clan. And then they give those women to the Benjamites as wives. Wrongdoing upon wrongdoing. And their stupid reasoning in this is that, well, we said we wouldn't give our daughters, but we're going to give these other people's daughters. And so we're not violating our pledge in doing this. But what they find is that's not enough women for the Benjamites. So they also allow them to seize the women of Shiloh. They say, hey, these women are going to be dancing, and you just go and take them. And they just force them into marriage. And again, their stupid reasoning is that they convince the fathers of these girls not to take revenge because they say, oh, this allows us to give wives to the Benjamites without breaking our oath because you didn't actually give them your daughters. The Benjamites take them. We just made them available, but the Benjamites are the ones to blame for the taking. It's a disaster. This is all a mess. This is a mess. It's terrible. This is what not to do. They have violated multiple of just even the basic 10 commandments, let alone the more detailed Levitical and Mosaic law. It's awful. So Judges 21:25 says, in those days Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. That's the concluding word of Judges. So here they are putting the blame not on themselves, which is where it belongs, but on the fact that they don't have a human king. So they're setting the stage for the time of the kings, saying if we had a human king, we would have been better. None of this would have happened. Well, guess what? That's not going to be true, but we'll talk about that when we get to the time of the kings. Also, they are forgetting that God was their king. They had the ultimate king. They had all they needed in God. And had they just turned back to God and followed his ways, none of this had to have happened. This is all the result of human sin. So what do we learn from these terrible stories? Well, God really does allow people to exercise their free will. Always within limits. He won't allow the derailment of his ultimate plan of redemption. And so we have seen already cases in the Old Testament where he steps in and directly stops what's happening. For instance, in the time of Noah with the flood, in the time of Moses, where he brings the people out of Egypt, there's direct confrontation. But look at how bad he can allow things to get. There's a lot he allows us to do. And it's painful to him. It's as painful to him as it is to those of us who watch this from the outside. And so we see in the story the painful reality of sin. We see its impact on the sinner and on the innocent people, kind of the bystanders who maybe weren't involved in the actual sin itself. It is awful. It is ugly. It is uglier than ugly. Nothing good comes out of it. And there is a steep price to pay, often by people who don't deserve to pay the price. But we also see that God is not absent amidst this chaos. God is right there. And at the beginning of Judges, they at least were turning back to him. At some point, it was bad enough that they said, "Oh yeah, God, help us. We're sorry. Please come deliver us." And he responds immediately. He is right there, ready for the people to turn back to him, ready for the people to repent. And he is there to offer grace and mercy when that happens. But when they stop turning back to him, they are unable to receive that grace and mercy. We have to receive it. God is freely offering it. But we have to turn around, face him, hold out our hands, and receive it. So clearly, this is most of these stories are what not to do. The Bible contains that. It contains what to do. It contains what not to do. Mostly in Judges, we get what not to do. And we see that when we forget to turn to God, eventually we succumb to what we want. And that's a life without God. The more you walk away, the more you follow that path of sin, the more you just think you've got things all figured out, that's what you will get. And eventually the results of that is you get far away enough from God that you end up without God. And that does not turn out well, as we have seen in Judges. Now, despite all this horror, there are faithful people still living in Israel during this time. And so we get to balance out all of this horror with the story of Ruth and the story of what it looks like when you do turn to God and you do receive the grace and mercy he offers. All right, so that finished. It's the end of our look at Judges, and next we'll turn to a much happier book, a much better ending of the story of Ruth.